For those listeners at home that don't know who I am, I'm Ethan Linehan, and I've been a member of Platypus since, I started attending reading group in the fall of 2016, and I've been a member since the summer of 2017. And I'm studying philosophy here in the graduate program. This is a teach-in that I've done a few times, but I hope this is the best version. I've made mistakes over the years. Platypus doesn't give us a script when we do this, so it's up to us to craft the best presentation we can. Okay. Thank you all very much for coming. Many of you likely set aside some important Friday night activities to be here because you were wondering what crazy things I might say about Marxism. What the word freedom has to do with the history of the left is terribly unclear. And my own background on this subject is rather atypical. My journey to Marxism, as I've joked before, it started in 2012 when I campaigned for Ron Paul. For years, I considered freedom and liberty and the associated values to be the highest of values. And I was convinced that the best way I could understand those ideals were through the magic acts of Penn Jillette and the madness of Ayn Rand. Whatever the right would tell me, I ate up. But I went through a reorientation to political questions that I won't go into just now because it puts way too much stock into Bernie Sanders. But after all that transition, socialism wasn't such a dirty word, and it was left to Platypus and those involved in it to properly contextualize what socialism means. I realized that the so-called socialism that the left teaches and preaches today is at best a half-truth and at worst a mendacious lie. And the appeal for me was the possibility that the left wasn't always this way, that it used to be, to a fault, concerned with freedom, and that it may be again. So, like I mentioned, this is a commonly given workshop in our organization that helps facilitate this reorientation. And I have some prepared remarks that will introduce some questions. If you allow me to stick to my script, I think I can be done in like 45 minutes. And then for the rest of the time allotted, it'll be Q&A. For you in the audience and for the listeners at home, all of what I will say and much of what I won't say because of time constraints is discussed in our reading group on campus. This workshop, it can't tell you everything you could ever know about Marxism, but it will gift you a shared vocabulary with which we could have a very productive conversation. And this teach-in really is as much for me as it is for you all. I am still learning this stuff for sure. I claim expertise in very few areas, perhaps baseball pitching mechanics, perhaps making a damn good meal on a tight budget, but certainly not Marxism. I'm less your teacher today than I am just the student that simply speaks first. And hopefully at the end of this you'll be able to explain to me, because it's still unclear, why in my room at home there's a picture of Marx and Lenin right beside a copy of the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so I'm going to go over just briefly what Platypus is as an organization. So Platypus Affiliated Society started in 2006 at the University of Chicago as a reading group between some faculty there and a group of students that were really interested in this history. Platypus studies the history of the left from its origins around 1700 through the present. And we can critique and educate towards a goal, the reconstitution of an emancipatory left. How do we do this? Well, we organize reading groups, public fora with speakers on panels, teach-ins like this one, and journalism through our Platypus Review, which I have copies of available on the table over there. And we also do research. And we call the activity that we do hosting the conversation, where we invite people from various backgrounds on the left to discuss both the history and the contemporary leftist ideals. I woke up this morning and my laser pointer / clicker was broken. The battery acid had corroded, and so I'm terribly upset that I have to use my mouse. clicking. This is snippets from our About Me on the Platypus webpage. And I want to draw your attention to the first sentence and the last sentence. The first sentence is, Platypus is a project for the self-criticism, self-education, and ultimately the practical reconstitution of a Marxian left. What has the left been, and what can it yet become? If the left is to change the world, it must first transform itself. Where are we now? Well, at some point or another, we've been on every continent except Antarctica. We have campus chapters in most major metropolitan cities in the world. This one is in its second year here at George Mason. We're very proud of it. We've published over 119 issues of the Platypus Review. More are forthcoming. We've held dozens of interviews with very famous speakers on the left, Noam Chomsky, David Harvey, Naomi Klein, very, very famous names on the left that are willing to engage with us. We've held 11 international conferences and also 2 European conferences. And we've hosted hundreds of conversations. Okay, and in this particular chapter here at George Mason, we meet every Monday at 5 p.m. in the Johnson Center for our reading group with a very well-curated syllabus that's been going on steadily for the entirety of Platypus. We also host coffee breaks every other Sunday in the Johnson Center, where we can discuss things like the Platypus Review or just whatever happens to be in the news that's relevant to the left. We host film screenings, more teach-ins, other panel discussions, and then available in print and online is the Platypus Review. So these are just a few examples of different events that Platypus has held. Back in 2014, I used to be at the University of Tennessee for my undergrad days, and that chapter held an event called Anarchism and Marxism, Radical Ideologies Today. That's actually how the person who recruited me to the Platypus Project, that's the event that brought him in a few years before me. The very next year, to kind of intersect the Ferguson riot moment, we had a panel called Black Politics and State Violence. And then I had a role in hosting this panel called Electoral Politics and the Left, Problems and Prospects, where right after the election, it was on the minds of everybody what potentially a socialist third party would look like if it was viable. This panel intersected that conversation. And then after we had the lovely opportunity to meet the Traditionalist Workers' Party, a far-right white nationalist group, we hosted this panel called No Nazis on Rocky Top, Anti-Racism in the Age of Trump. And then coming up in 2 weeks from this past Wednesday, George Mason is hosting a panel called Freedom in the Anthropocene. It's going to be a moderated panel on ecology, history, and capital. And we have 3 very quality speakers coming to talk about what seems to be on everybody's minds these days. And we have more panels in the works. You can read more about what we end up planning on our social media. We have Black Politics and the Left, Women, the Longest Revolution, and the American Revolution Unfinished, ? And then I'm giving some more teach-ins, one on Nietzsche and one on Lukács, and perhaps others as we go forth. Okay. Are you all ready to get started? Thumbs up? Okay. Raise your hands if you've ever watched a TV show or heard of the TV show called The Walking Dead. Now keep them raised if you've ever seen The Handmaid's Tale, Battlestar Galactica, Black Mirror, The Man in the High Castle. Okay, put your hands down. Now raise them again if you've ever watched a movie called The Hunger Games, 1984, or read the book. V for Vendetta, I Am Legend, Idiocracy, Zombieland, The Matrix, Fahrenheit 451, A Clockwork Orange, Mad Max, Blade Runner, and WALL-E. Okay, put your hands down. Now, if you looked around the room during this game we just played, you saw how popular these TV shows and films were. And they have at least one thing in common. They are all dystopian. Popular culture is saturated with these dystopian visions of the end of times, zombie apocalypses, cannibalism, Big Brother watchman states, widespread sterilization, unexplained, and otherwise unpleasant futures. Add to that what the media will show relating to environmental catastrophe and nuclear disaster, and you may never see a happy moment on screen. Now stop and ask yourself this. Why are dystopian visions for the future so prevalent, while utopian visions are notably absent? When was the last time you saw a cultural creation with a healthier, freer society that had worked out some of the problems from which we suffer today? What does it mean for our future as humans that we can neither imagine what it would mean to be greater than we are today, nor can we imagine how we might achieve such a utopian future? In this teaching, I hope to facilitate these questions. And the proposal I want you all to entertain is that Marxism is the method most necessary for inspiring that imagination. Marxism formerly was the vehicle for discovering any possibilities for change that existed and how we might harness that potential. In this teaching, I am going to explain what Marxism once was and its historic significance for changing the world. And an hour from now, you may feel interested in the long-forgotten history of Marxism. In a follow-up teaching next month, stay tuned on social media for when that is, I'm going to tackle the legacy of Marxism. Why, despite its pretensions to freedom, was the Marxist project such a total failure? Why does it remain history's most interesting failure? So please join us next month to learn why Marxism is perhaps completely irrelevant after the tragedy of the 21st century, and also why it remains our only hope for freedom. Okay. Moving on to the next slide. Some of my transitions were gone. Okay. The history of mankind has for centuries been divided into varying periods. Natural scientists are fond of words like Pleistocene, Holocene, Anthropocene, etc. In my Catholic youth days, we always thought in terms of the creation of the world, the birth of Christ, and then the expected end of times. Literature studies, I'm told, for years have split history into antiquity, the Middle Ages, and then modern times. And of course, all of these periodizations are not disinterested. They're not passive divisions at all. Ultimately, one's account of the past means a great deal for one's account of the present. The narrative that Marxists historically found constructive goes something like from prehistory to traditional society to bourgeois society, and then perhaps to communism. Now, this story begins when humankind starts to distinguish itself from mere nature. Just as all animals do, humans too have to work to stay alive. After all, we are not plants. We ourselves are natural animals, but there is a way in which we are different from other animals. There are animals with a certain type of self-relation, and there are animals with a very different self-relation. What separates humans from animals is how we organize our life-sustaining work, and very importantly, that we can reflect on this process. Now, as soon as our ancestors emerged from the jungle, so to speak, humans arranged themselves in close blood groups or kinships. These kinship groups organize the process of taking raw materials from nature and adding a new element to them, human labor. Human labor can take raw food and cook it, animal bones and carve them, iron and forge it, etc. That humans have the physical and mental power to substantially alter what they find in nature was obvious as early as 200,000 years ago. You can add another 30,000 years to that and humans are wearing clothing. Add another 100,000 years and the first known cave paintings appeared. Around 64,000 BC, humans replaced the spear with the bow and arrows. Before 50,000 BC, you had sewing needles and musical instruments. Add 8,000 years to that, and you have ships that can travel through harsh oceans to fish in deep waters. Shortly after 30,000 BC, ovens replaced mere fireplaces. Pottery and basket weaving allowed the carrying and storing of goods. Humans could make rope, tools like harpoons, saws, that sort of thing. Humans are inclined to make their lives easier. Why work hard when you can work smart, is what my dad always said. More free time is the default desire. With every new tool or technique, subsisting was easier. In the thousands of years of prehistory just covered, humans increased their productive capabilities so much that authorities estimate the population of the Earth was already at 5 million by 10,000 BC. With such productive capacities available, the relationships which people have with each other, in order to fulfill their basic needs, were bound to change. Okay. Now, where formerly human kinship groups consisted of nomadic hunter-gatherer types, resources were usually so scarce that survival was a daily struggle. Whatever resources were secured were distributed to the entire kin group without any notions of private ownership. All members of kin demanded free access to nature, the main means of production. Any notions of leadership were also absent beyond the kin group elder or a strong hunter or gatherer that would decide questions about distribution. Imagine you're at Thanksgiving dinner and you just kind of decide that grandma's going to cut the turkey and divvy it out. Okay. Then around the year 10,000 BC, tremendous changes happened to human behavior. Humans passed through the agricultural revolution. Knowledge about crop and animal domestication exploded. Large-scale agriculture was possible, and larger populations could be supported in settled communities. Increases in productive capacity allowed humans to produce more than they needed. Kinship groups could produce an extra called a surplus. This surplus gave humans the freedom to progress beyond mere subsistence and focus on other things. And I cannot overemphasize how important that social surplus is. Without a surplus, society is impossible. There would be nothing to invest in growth towards the future. And so you'll hear me use words like exploitation later. This originally didn't have a negative connotation. The etymology of that word basically just translates exploitation as the act of utilizing something. In this case, labor being exploited or used is essential for productivity. Humans, through their creative powers, ended their daily dependence on nature for survival. But how often has fixing one problem created new and different problems? Once society could create a surplus, that surplus had to be managed somehow. The role of collecting and redistributing surpluses had to be filled if all the members of the community were able to meet their basic needs. Now you can imagine how over time the person or group in charge of production and distribution of that surplus could become a source of privilege. You get this in Friedrich Engels' work on the origin, what is it called? On the state, private property, and the family. The person or family might skim some off the top at the expense of others just to make sure that he and his are taken care of. The emergence of control over the means of production by a section of society was a radical departure in human social arrangements. Labor was no longer controlled by society as a whole. Such societies ceased to be communities with a common interest and became divided. No longer did society work to meet the needs of everyone. Rather, one class in society owned the means of production while the other classes had to labor for the owning class. Each class looked out for their own interests. The old way of life broke down once that mode of production changed, and you'll see that pattern happen again as we go along. All right, next slide. Now, some of the earliest class-based, or perhaps I might even say caste-based societies should be familiar to you. They took the form of masters and slaves. Masters owned the means of production, and they bought or captured slaves to labor for them. Whatever slaves produced, the masters took and sold, and the masters gave just enough back to the slaves to survive and pocketed the rest. Naturally, the class antagonisms between masters and slaves led to open conflict. It was at this point in human history that something like a state was invented. Armed bodies were needed to keep order. Laws and religions were needed to shape public ideology. The state didn't always exist, and as you might guess at, the state doesn't always have to exist. The state is merely an instrument for one group to dominate another. Now, following the collapse of Rome in Europe, the primary mode of production developed again. And for various contingent historical reasons, Western Europe became the locus of a new way of life. Social relations changed with it. Slave societies, at least there, were replaced by feudal societies. Under feudalism, the class who labors is not made of slaves, but peasants. And peasants are, importantly, not the property of the feudal lord. They own themselves. The feudal lord still owns the tools and the lands, though. The lord allows the peasant and his family to live on the lands. The peasant works Monday through Wednesday on his own land, taking home whatever he produces. But Thursday through Saturday, the peasant works on the lord's land, producing the surplus. And when these days are finished with, the lord of the manor takes whatever the peasant produces. On Sunday, the peasant rests to do it all again the next week. Now, from around 10,000 BC to somewhere around the year 1500 of the Common Era, traditional societies manifested in some variation of one of those archetypes. Within these societies, every member knew his or her role. If you're familiar with the caste system in India, then you should know what I mean. Your role in life was predetermined. You would grow up to be a carpenter because your dad was a carpenter, because your granddad was a carpenter, and so on. The nobility knew their place in society too. Even if a prince squandered his wealth and became destitute, he was still noble by birth. Traditional societies had what is called the great chain of being. The same way of living was reproduced generation after generation after generation. You fulfilled your purpose in life if you died knowing that you carried on that tradition. You always had a role to participate in some meaningful way. And we moderns might frown on these societies because the great chain had little upward mobility. But perhaps if you could sympathize with the ancients, you might find that stability guaranteed by the traditional way of life somewhat attractive. Okay, but all things change, and in this teach-in, traditional society changes too. Beginning around the 16th century, human development entered into what historians call bourgeois society. In Europe, the Renaissance led to an explosion of culture and the development of human creativity. Scientists largely rejected the dogmatism and mystical worldview of the medieval churches in favor of empirical knowledge and a rational understanding of the world. Theology was not the only domain to radically change in bourgeois society. Bourgeois society, the Enlightenment, is also translated as the Epoch of Lights because it's supposed to clearly contrast with the Dark Ages that came before it. The Enlightenment dominated the minds of thinkers for generations. In the cafes and salons of Europe, reason became the byword for justifying everything. Immanuel Kant, in his famous pamphlet, What is Enlightenment, that we read in our reading group, unofficially made the motto of the era sapere aude, or dare to know. And philosophers did not stay up in the ivory towers or in their new science labs. The top names of the day came to influence politics in ways never before seen. Systems of authority were only legitimate insofar as they were rational, if they could advance the ideals of liberty, fraternity, and equality. Gone was the public toleration for authoritarian governments and absolutist monarchies. Here were the new modern ideals of democratic republics founded on classical liberal social contracts and human rights. And nowhere was this clearer than in the two most famous revolutions of the Enlightenment era, the American and French revolutions. The old divine right of kings was replaced by the consent of the governed. The new modern values of the Enlightenment were best articulated by philosophers we hold dear in the reading group. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the first theorist of society, conceived the notion of what he called perfectibility, that the possibilities for being human are multiple and endless. Rousseau put unusual stress on history as the site where the true nature of humans is simultaneously realized and perverted, revealed and distorted. A new way of thinking about the human condition had appeared, that society, rather than nature, can be a source of freedom. As Rousseau taught, the man in part produces his own being. Rousseau wrote that while animals were machines functioning in a limited way in their specific natural environment, humans could reflect upon their own machinery and thus change it. We do not act strictly according to a permanent nature or a fixed essence. Rather, we produce our own nature. History is the record of that self-production. It's the creative activity of a historical being. I'm going to interject real quick. Do you know if the Facebook live stream is working? Okay. Rousseau understood that the most radical possibilities of freedom take place in society, the site of new and alien powers, which he cannot employ without the help of other men. Rousseau adds that civil society is where for the first time, humanity sacrifices their natural freedom and in return gets a moral or a political freedom, which alone makes man truly the master of himself. For to be driven by appetite alone is slavery, and obedience to the law that one has prescribed for oneself is liberty. That's a quote. Moral freedom, or your autonomy, is obedience to a rule or a principle that you impose on yourself. It's the freedom to act in unnatural ways. For Rousseau, such freedom was radically ambivalent. To steal a phrase from Nietzsche, it's a kind of freedom that's beyond good and evil. Society is constantly changing those concepts of good and evil, in fact. However, only in society could real freedom be achieved, when humans free themselves from their natural animal condition. The problem in which society had fallen could only be solved socially, not individually. For Rousseau, it was human nature to be free, but first society had to be clear about its aims, in practice and in theory. And Rousseau was the first to articulate that new modern task of social freedom. Another theorist we read in the reading group is Hegel, and he wrote that the principle of freedom dawned on the world in Rousseau. Now, Hegel built upon both Kant and Rousseau in his pursuit of, quote, the philosophy of history, and he accounted for changes in freedom. And he wanted his readers to ask, what is rational in history? I'm just going to draw your attention to the final sentence here. It is the final goal, freedom, toward which all the world's history has been working. It is the goal to which all the sacrifices have been brought upon the broad altar of the earth in the long flow of time. History is only meaningful for Hegel to the extent that it's a story of freedom. Everything?
It's on a live stream.
Okay. I'm going to quickly interject you.
It was live for about a minute and a half.
No! Oh well. I guess somebody maybe ended it. Okay, so bourgeois citizens were attracted to the destruction of traditional society because they were witnessing the destruction of all fixed, one-sided ways of living. The separation of society into strict castes was abolished. Without the great chain of being, people felt like they could truly relate to one another. Now, for the vast majority of common people, for those who were ignorant of divinity and without noble titles, who for most of history were peasants living through subsistence agriculture, they were the mute background against the pageantry of the ancient world. For those people, bourgeois society was truly revolutionary and freeing. They had never owned any property before. They were formerly nothing, but after the revolts of the common people throughout Europe, they became everything. Humans, now at least, owned their own ability to labor. By selling one's capacity to labor, anyone could become self-made. They would do so on the basis of their work, their activity in society, and that found purchase not in a strict hierarchy of traditional values, but rather through a free market of goods. People would be free to find their own values in society, not have them imposed upon them. The highest values in modern society are not religion or the honor of a warrior code, but rather material productivity and efficiency. How many times have you been told to be a productive member of society? In a market society, the rational pursuit of one's own self-interest was understood to contribute to the betterment of society as a whole.
Stop recording.
Okay, let's see if you can get it going again. In a market society, you are neither a slave to a master, nor are you the serf to a lord. You are neither property nor indentured. You are free to sign contracts with anyone offering them, and in return for a wage, you will labor productively for a specific increment of time. You're free to leave your farm and take work in the city. You can leave your boring country and find work in exotic places. When bourgeois social relations came onto the scene, it felt like a human could be a free individual for the first time. Everyone was considered free to better themselves, and progress was understood to emerge out of civil society, out of commerce and exchange. The members of a market consciously reflected on their own practices, actively guiding the direction of their own development. Every individual was contributing to a greater unfolding of freedom, of social progress, simply on the basis of their own self-interested labor. This is just Adam Smith 101, that a social right to property is what must be protected in order to facilitate cooperation, which in turn facilitates productivity, which is freedom. The division of labor also works towards that end, but it's really only a means. Same for the market. Smith is about what you might call independence through interdependence. Everyone can participate because they all have something to sell, even if it's only their labor. For Smith, the world of commercial society is one grounded in the free labor of the newly emergent class, a class of city dwellers, or bourgeois people, freed from serfdom and customary claims to their life. The masses of humanity have not ceased to demand a world in which they do not require the benevolence of the baker, the butcher, or the brewer, but only their self-interest in order to live their lives as they choose under the law. And to this day, that emancipation is only available to the broad masses of the population in precisely the way in which Smith demanded it, in other words, by wage labor. To this day, the great democratic demand is that people should be subject to no arbitrary power of wealth, but only to the power allowed to the owner of money, command over labor. An individual exercises power over the actions of others. He lays a claim to social wealth insofar as he possesses money. He carries his social power and his bond to society in his pocket. Importantly, there's nothing evil about that process. Profit's just a reserve supply taken today to guarantee productivity tomorrow. You have to replenish the materials and pay a wage in advance of selling the produce. Capitalists are just managers of the general will. The laborers know full and well that they add value by laboring, and part of that value is paid to the employer for his subsistence. There is no mystery in the contract covering up exploitation. It's a fair exchange of equivalents, a wage for labor power. The employer is just a merchant that takes the produce to the market and reinvests in the venture. And being a capitalist is understood as one way the division of labor manifests itself. You do your job, I'll do mine, and we'll both contribute to society. That a commercial society is class divided, for Smith that represents an achievement. And the fact is that the historical emergence of freedom was occasioned by the demand for class society. The people themselves demanded a form of private property adequate to the demand for their work. One's part in the division of labor was the freedom from necessary labor, such that we could maximize the amount of freedom in society. The commodities that we exchange with one another are supposed to be the possibilities for our perfectibility, for our self-transformation, etc. Now, Adam Smith gave expression to that society simultaneously engaged in the completion of its self-emancipation through wage labor, and a society on the cusp of industrialization, a development that will ultimately deepen, destabilize, and threaten to undermine that very self-emancipation. As humankind stood poised to develop forces of production adequate to abstract labor, Smith grasps labor's abstract generality as emancipation from caste bondage, and he thus pushes for the generalization of wage labor as the universalization of freedom from custom and tradition. And Smith would have regarded anything short of that kind of freedom on the basis of labor as a reversion to old feudal methods. Marx could not agree more, though he demands that the project be pushed further. Now, capitalism begins to undermine the yardstick by which it produces surplus value, namely labor on the individual level. Quote, "The surplus labor of the masses has ceased to be the condition for the development of general wealth," end quote. After the Industrial Revolution, labor as the measure of value becomes anachronistic. The production process is almost totally socialized now. In other words, individual production hardly exists, but it's treated as if production is still individual. Every product made is the combined effort of 1,000 workers in a cooperative process. The individual worker literally counts less in the production process. Marx gives the example of one man not being able to lift a tree that he cuts down, but 1,000 men can lift that tree with one finger. But just because the forces of production are outdated doesn't mean that the social relations have caught up yet. People still relate to each other in this society on the basis of being able to exchange their labor, even though that measurement is becoming obsolete. Imagine a shoe that fits too tightly because the foot inside has kept growing. Everything is socially produced, but privately owned, and it's outside the control of society. There is not yet joint mastery over the communal, social, productive powers. We still have the social imperative that neither production nor consumption can take place without the mediation of exchange value. Marx formulates the inherent contradiction of capitalism as, quote, "a contradiction between production and realization of surplus value." The capitalist must not only extract surplus value, but must also realize that surplus value. He has to convert that surplus into money. And ultimately, and this is where I'm still learning at this whole Marxism thing, but ultimately, we're now stuck producing not for production's sake and therefore for our own freedom, how Adam Smith imagined, but rather we produce for capital's sake. Capital becomes the capitalist. The biggest problem with how the left teaches capitalism is that it's taught as a system of worker exploitation. The left today focuses on the profit part of surplus value, trying to make the contradiction of capitalism into a simple matter of greedy bosses cheating their workers. But the problem is really that capital comes to be its own thing and its own reproducer. It's not called capitalistism. Marx, in the Communist Manifesto in Chapter 2, says that capital is not a thing, but it's rather a social relation. And to think capitalism could be summed up by calling it exploitative is actually rather optimistic. There was an economist in the 1960s named Joan Robinson. She famously joked that, quote, "The misery of being exploited by capitalists is nothing compared to the misery of not being exploited at all." Capitalism renders millions of people literally useless, valueless, replaceable, because machines can do the work cheaper and better. Now, I'm going to quote Marx real quick. "Capital has not invented surplus labor. Wherever a part of society possesses a monopoly of the means of production, the laborer, free or not, must add to the working time necessary for his own maintenance and extra working time in order to produce the means of subsistence for the owners of the means of production." Now, this is Marx again. "What is unique about capitalism is the way in which constant capital, or accumulated labor, dominates over variable capital, or living labor. Only in capitalist society does accumulated labor dominate living labor. In the handicrafts and manufacture, the workman makes use of a tool. In the factory, the machine makes use of him. Under capitalist domination, modern technology has converted the workman into a mere automaton. Every kind of capitalist production, insofar as it is not only a labor process, but also a process of creating surplus value, has this in common, that it is not the workman that employs the instruments of labor, but the instruments of labor that employ the workman." End quote. Now, the contradiction is about the superfluousness of the worker. Human labor time becomes increasingly unnecessary in the production process, yet human labor time also remains the basis of value under capitalism. Capitalism is not like slavery or feudalism because there's no concrete domination of one group of men by another. Rather, with capitalism comes abstract social domination, where man confronts capital as the machine that commands and subsumes his labor. Capital is created by the labor of all people, and it acts on all people. Dead labor, in other words, the accumulated social intellect, mainly as technology and machinifacture, dominates living labor. And the more dead labor there is, the less living labor there is, the higher unemployment there is, and the more intensified the domination of the working class is. A Marxist theoretician named Theodor Adorno said in 1968 that, quote, "Unfreedom, dependency upon an apparatus that has escaped the control of those who use it, has spread out universally over mankind." End quote. In Adam Smith's era, there was no such thing as permanent unemployment. At the very least, there was the expectation that through the division of labor, we would always be able to find employment for everyone. You could break something down into smaller parts, or you could create new commodities and therefore new jobs in their production. Now, Smith did live in the times of machines and inventions, but for him they were labor-saving, whereas in Marx's era they become labor-replacing. Another Marxist theoretician, Max Horkheimer, said that automation has made not work, but the worker superfluous. Now, I'm getting to the end of my teaching here, but so many dystopian movies and shows depict a future where robots have taken over and the state arbitrarily decides who gets to live through political maneuvers. But automation and state-administered welfare are already becoming a reality in our lifetime. How many news reports show you that fast food workers are being replaced by machines, or that drivers for logistics companies are being replaced by self-driving trucks? Those jobs don't exist anymore, but the people that used to work those jobs still exist. They still exist with all the needs for money and resources that they used to have, but now they have no job. When your livelihood is tied to having a job, and the jobs in large part disappear, then your livelihood is in danger. When the freedom of bourgeois society comes from being able to do wage labor, but there's not enough wage labor for every member of society, then the limitations of bourgeois society should be called into question. Now, the pre-Marxist socialists of earlier days, pre-Marx, certainly criticized the capitalist mode of production and its consequences, but they could not explain them, and therefore they could not get mastery of them. They could only reject capitalism as bad. The more strongly the earlier socialists denounced the exploitation of the working class, inevitable under capitalism, the less able were they to clearly show in what this exploitation consisted and how it arose. For that, Marx was necessary. Marx confronted the language of bourgeois political economy with its own claims, and he saw that capitalism both actualized and undermined its very promises for freedom. I'm going to skip over these quotes real quick. We read them in the reading group. They're wonderful. Marx thought that socialism embodied the revolutionary potential of capitalism, but it needed to be grounded as a science, as a historical method, rather than a utopian fantasy. Marx came to the conclusion that capitalism must be overcome on the basis of capitalism itself. There's no hope for going backwards to some simpler time, to an idyllic past. Only a society based on the free exchange of labor developed the possibility for a society beyond labor. The essential meaning of capitalism is that there must be freedom beyond labor, where any human labor which can be replaced by non-human labor has ceased. All human labor that can be done by a machine gets replaced by a machine. But this can only be achieved socially, and especially politically, in and through labor. So who is capable of making this happen? Well, in traditional society, we were driven to work for our preservation and for the preservation of the status quo, with little or no change. Under capitalism, however, we are driven to work for the preservation of capital, which requires constant change, constant development. And to keep this secret, one has to reach for the eternal, the biological, the metaphysical. The business cycle is said to be subject to laws created not by individuals and not with purpose and deliberation. Sometimes the capitalists make use of these laws, but ultimately they're blind and we must accept them as fact. These economic laws are said to be like the laws of planet rotation, in other words, unchangeable and natural. Bourgeois ideology fetishizes these laws. It turns them into real things, or it explains them mystically and fatefully. But really, all these laws that are considered outside of man are wholly dependent upon man and the way we arrange our social existence. Therefore, these laws can be changed. Now today, it's difficult to imagine because we question freedom. We have reverted to regarding ourselves as products of an alien act, moved wholly by external compulsion. But this loses track of the specific consciousness of history that Marxism was all about. Marxism is about grasping the historical specificity of bourgeois society and, by extension, capitalism. With Marx came the realization that bourgeois society might itself be transitional, that the end goal of humanity might not be found in the productive individual, but that this society might point beyond itself. Capitalism, for Marx, is nothing if not the thwarted potential for socialism. Marxism relates to socialism only insofar as it shows the achievements and limitations of capitalism, and proposes socialism as a way to advance the progression of freedom in history. If the workers can eliminate competition among themselves, then the very foundations of capitalism will be cut out from under its feet. The unemployed would not be excluded from being productive, nor would the capitalists. By eliminating the need to work for capital, we would be free to change our needs. We can fundamentally change what it means to be human, to discover new freedoms and possibilities hitherto never dreamed. As was the promise of bourgeois society, humankind as a whole can consciously guide its transformation, rather than being unwitting victims to forces larger than itself. Socialism will be the promise of bourgeois society actualized. The stakes of the proletarian struggle for socialism encompass the historical significance of the entire bourgeois epoch. Whether capitalism represents emancipation for all, whether it was something new, a new potential for humanity, or perhaps it turns out to be the same old thing. In other words, naked domination and simple unfreedom. Was the bourgeois revolution an act of usurpation by a new exploiting class, which you might hear by other left groups on campus? Or, rather, was it an emancipatory act? The question is whether the proletariat can make itself the last exploited class in history. Whether the proletariat can allow the potential of capital to overcome itself and transcend the entire history of civilization. Now, with Marx, it becomes clear that something lies beyond capitalism, and the only force capable of making that future a reality are the working masses or any potential working masses. But it still remains unclear who is willing to accept that task of inaugurating the transition. Now, I believe we can and we must reconstitute an emancipatory left capable of changing the world. And if you join me next month for the follow-up teach-in to this, I'm going to discuss the failure of Marxism. We'll have to address why Marxism has not achieved the classless society, what is the state of Marxism today, and why Platypus matters for clearing the obstacles to freedom. So to conclude this teach-in, I'm going to ask you all to be very realistic in your utopias, to always ask yourself what it would mean to be freer, and what it would take to get there, and always ask yourself this: does Marxism even matter?